Hi everyone, in this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at a game played by Viktor Korchnoi and Anatoly Karpov, two very strong Soviet chess players. This was played in the 1981 World Chess Championship match in Merano, Italy, and the champion is Karpov, and the challenger is Korchnoi. Korchnoi starts the game with c4, the English opening, and now e6. Knight c3, and now d5, and after d4, bishop e7, and this is kind of the Ala Tortsov variation of the Queen's Gambit declined. And after knight f3 was played, knight f6 by Karpov. Just developing. Bishop g5, and now h6. Okay. Bishop h4, and now castles by Karpov. Rook c1, and now d takes c4. So just winning a pawn. e3, and now c5, so striking in the center. There's no way to defend the c4 pawn, so best is just getting counterplay by maybe trading flank pawn for a central pawn, which is what Karpov does. And after bishop takes c4, c takes d4 was played, and here Korchnoi made a very huge commitment. He plays e takes d4, and basically he is committed to playing with an IQP for essentially the rest of the game. E takes d4 was played, and now knight c6. And here, I've been noticing that Korchnoi had many opportunities to get rid of his IQP, yet he never did it. And after castles, knight h5, bishop takes e7, knight takes e7, I was wondering why Korchnoi did not play d5. And d5 is played with the idea that Korchnoi is either getting rid of his IQP, or he might get a passed pawn. And a variation you could look at is, let's say b6 was played. This would give Korchnoi a passed pawn. And after d6, this is way better for him. He has a passed pawn. All of his pieces can be included to help the advance of the passed pawn. And how does Karpov really stop the passed pawn? I mean, his bishop has to either be tied down there forever, or he has to do something very crazy. So, it's just, I'm curious why Korchnoi didn't go for this. Perhaps after e takes d5, he was afraid of knight takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop takes d5. Queen takes d5 could be played as well, but bishop takes d5. And after knight f4, perhaps the initiative that Karpov could get after this is what made Korchnoi decide not to play the d5 move. So instead he goes bishop b3, and maybe he is preparing d5 under better circumstances, I'm really not sure. But I just thought that d5 was the best way to play, since it gets rid of the weakest thing in White's camp. So knight f6 was played, and here Korchnoi goes knight e5. He is trying to occupy the center, and the main reason why Karpov wants to exchange all of the minor pieces, and the main reason why he played knight h5 over here, was because he will use an idea that can very commonly be used when you play against the IQP. So bishop e7, knight e7, bishop e3, and now he brings the knight back, and after knight e5, he plays bishop d7. And this idea will only work if your opponent manages to exchange all or most of the minor pieces off the board. And you should not exchange the major pieces for that same reason. Queen e2 was played, and now we have rook c8, just occupying the c-file, developing a rook. And after knight e4, here Karpov exchanges more pieces. And this is mainly because he wants to play against that IQP with a very good advantage. Queen takes e4 was played, and this allows more piece exchanges, if not a better position for Karpov. And after bishop c6 was played, if you simply exchange the pieces, which is what Korchnoi did, then Karpov is going to be better because of that idea that we're going to discuss later on. And if the pieces aren't exchanged, and let's say you play something like queen d3, I mean, look at Karpov's bishop. It's doing a very good job of attacking the king, and after something like queen b6, I mean, Karpov is all developed, who knows, maybe he'll play something like rook d8, whatnot. But instead, Korchnoi just takes the bishop, and after rook takes c6, Karpov is gaining a good advantage. You see that he wants to play rook d6, he wants to bring this rook to the d file as well. He has so many different options, whereas Korchnoi is limited to just defending the IQP. Rook c3 by Korchnoi. If rook takes c6 is played, then after b takes c6, the same idea is going to work. So you don't want that to happen. And rook c3, and if you take the rook, which didn't happen, queen d6 was instead played. If you take this rook, then after b takes c3, there's no longer an IQP, and I believe white is even better here. So queen d6 was played, and this is the main reason why Karpov wanted to exchange all of the minor pieces, but he wanted to keep the major pieces on the board, because he will simply put all of his pieces on the d file, and the amount of pressure that is going to come from the attack on the d file is going to be too much for Korchnoi to handle. So he, after g3 was played, rook d8, rook d1, and now rook b6. Of course, Karpov wants to play queen d7, but if he does this too soon, then bishop to a4, and now there's going to be an exchange loss. So rook b6 was instead played, and now queen to e1. Queen d7, and now rook c to d3. Korchnoi needs to defend the d-pawn with all of his pieces, and you can see that it's tying down all of his pieces, and it's getting Karpov's pieces a lot of active squares. So rook d6, queen e4, queen c6, queen f4, just some maneuvering. Unfortunately, you can't capture the queen because knight takes c6, and you don't have d5 because there's knight e7, and there's still a pin on the pawn. So after rook c3, all of this could happen, and in the end, rook b5 is playable. And if you don't want to lose the b2 pawn, you could play b3, but after king g6, winning rook and pawn endgame. So instead, queen f4, just ignoring the queen trade, and now knight d5. Just centralizing the knight, and it's getting ready to play a move like knight b4 and just attack the rook on d3. Queen d2 was played, and queen b6, preparing knight b4. Bishop takes d5 was played, rook takes d5, and queen c6 was played, queen c3, queen d7 was played, f4 was played, b6 was played, just getting ready to build up on the position, rook b4, and now an interesting move, b5. And it's interesting because, well, why would you just play b6 and then b5? And the idea is that now there's actually a threat that you can use to continue your expansion, assuming that white plays a slow move like h3. If this happens, then after a5 attacking the rook will go back to b3, and now b4. And how do you defend rook captures d4? You simply can't, and you will lose that pawn, and with these extended pawns on the queen side, it's hard to really try attacking them and treating them like targets. So, hence, after b5, a4 was played, and now we have b takes a4. If you play a5 trying to go for the same idea, then white has rook takes b5, and after this, he is able to untangle. Queen takes b5, and white, even though he has to still continue defending the pawn, he's not as bad as when e5 was a threat and all that. So here, b takes a4 was played, queen a3, and now a5, attacking the rook and forcing rook takes a4. Queen b5, and now rook to d2. And here, Karpov finally manages to execute e5, and of course you can't play d takes e5 because you lose the rook, and if you just don't do anything, then you are going to lose the d4 pawn. So f takes e5, rook takes e5, and of course you're not going to capture because then you would let rook captures d2, and black is getting a very good initiative. So queen a1 instead, queen e8, and if you don't capture this rook, let's say you play rook d1, since rook e1 is a threat, then rook e2, and you do not want to be playing this position. There is a threat of queen e3 check, and if you try defending it with rook a3, then queen e4, and I mean there are too many threats. You can't deal with all of them. So instead, d takes e5 was forced, and this is exactly what Karpov wants, because now his pieces are very active, and despite the fact that Korchnoi is winning a pawn, after queen c6, how do you really stop this? You can't really play king to f1 because there's queen to h1 checkmate. So now you must start resorting to checks. Rook a8 check, king h7, queen b1 check, and now g6. You could also play rook c2, but Karpov decides to play g6. He is equally as good. And after queen to f1, Korchnoi has a very nice trick. You might be thinking, well, the rook is hanging. Why not just capture it? Well, if you capture the rook, then unfortunately there's a perpetual. Queen takes d7 check, king h8, queen f6 check, king h7. If you try to escape with king g8, then you might even lose your rook, and this is actually winning for white. King h8, queen takes h6 check, king g8, and now you even lose your rook. You're down 4 pawns, and this is essentially the time to resign. So you can't capture the rook, and you just have to basically go for a perpetual. You should just continue playing king h7, but then queen f7 check will be played, and this is a perpetual. So you can't capture the rook. There's something even better that you can play. And I encourage you to pause the video and find out what Karpov played. It's a very nice maneuver. Okay, so Karpov played the move queen to c5 check. And after king h1, which is really the only move, queen d5 check. And you're not threatening to capture the rook. That's not the point. The point is to win the queen. And you do so after rook to d1 is played. And here, you lose the queen as white. You'd probably have to play something like rook a1. But after rook takes f1 check, let's say rook takes f1, queen takes e5 is easily winning for Karpov. Hence, after the move queen d5 check was played, Korchnoi resigned the game, and a very nice victory for Anatoly Karpov, and it shows us just how to play against an isolated queen pawn. So I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comment section, and stay tuned for more chess.